further. So if Eli Jellenic is ready to come up, we'll move on to the next presentation.
Also to you, Father Tiso, and to everyone, indeed. Thank you to the organizers for agreeing to let me speak here once again. Dr. Samuel may remember with some either nostalgia or residual annoyance that I followed Father Tiso's lead in going over the first time you chaired a panel on which I was speaking. I will do my very best to avoid that mistake again. I make no promises. So, basically want to discuss epistemology, specifically as it intersects from the Buddhist, more particularly in our case, the Vajrayana tradition here, with its counterpart of Western origin. Really hard to say it's any longer, strictly speaking, Western, but we can just call it, sort of the international cosmopolitanized notion of philosophy that's taught in English language and many other European language schools. So at the intersection of these two traditions of epistemology, there is significant overlap. I'm arguing enough to help provide a deeper ground that we can step back to mediate and encourage and resolve difficulties in the ongoing dialogue between Vajrayana and the community of scientists that study it, and the collaboration between members of those communities. Where we are right now, and as indeed the theme of this conference shows us, that this dialogue is now firmly established and making continuous progress, not just in a direct line, but it's proliferating into various other or various additional subdisciplines and interdisciplinary inquiries. In the past 20, 25 years of progress in this mutual endeavor, the accumulation of evidence, right, of empirics at least, is now no longer any sort of significant shortcoming, as it was in the early days when most of the speculation that brought people together in the kind of dialogue we're having here now focused on. But with thousands of studies, tens of thousands of published papers, able to be compared, contrasted, have their data and their arguments pitted against each other, ever refining the confidence in the resulting knowledge that results from this, well, we don't have to worry too much anymore about asking the question of whether it's a viable and worthwhile endeavor. What remains, however, are open questions about the future pathways it may take, the questions of emphasis on which research programs deserve or at least warrant some degree of priority, either logically or in terms of time and attention spent teaching them, funding them. The same kinds of debates that mark every other field of science. And of course, as many proper scientists, those who practice it daily, will tell you, they don't necessarily need philosophers to weigh in on their activity, much as a bird doesn't need a bird watcher. However, the philosophical overlay is for the rest of us, right, to help us interpret how we may understand, integrate, and make use of the findings. So with accumulating evidence, obvious and available to anyone interested in the intersection of contemplative science and its practice, Buddhist or otherwise, some of the limitations now are at the level of theory. Although the Vajrayana science dialogue has matured considerably, it still remains in a transitional phase or a transformative phase. So I don't mean to suggest that there's any instability there, just that developments that occur now still at this phase of the relationship can have far-reaching consequences of path dependency, as it's often called in science and philosophy. The consequences that are outsized compared to the significance of the events or the interpretations of the research output that led to them. So let us proceed confidently, but with due care. So evaluation of scientific research programs occurs from within the discourse itself, just within the publication and pitting and argument of findings and the theories used to guide and explain them among those devising and conducting the experiments themselves, but also in the philosophy of science literature. And it's that layer of inquiry that connects the scientific endeavor to other areas of scholarship, to the popular imagination, to policy. It provides, at its very best, a common frame of reference, a set of ideas, not to crystallize the debate, but just to provide a standard vocabulary about which to argue about it, right? We may not agree on everything, but let us at least agree on the terms by which we will disagree. Let us at least strive for clarity in our disagreement. If we're going to disagree or agree, let us be sure that we're doing so about the same objects, those that we intend. So, knowing that the relationship is fruitful, these general depictions of Vajrayana as a whole, of science as a whole, is often remarked. There's as much diversity and plurality within each of those labels to override any noteworthy distinction between them. So, just as a caveat, let's not overemphasize the difference between the concept of Vajrayana or Buddhism, when in fact there are so many varieties and so many different perspectives and outlooks within it. Same can be said of science. This is why we need sort of a unifying epistemic philosophical layer of discourse to help us make sense of this variety, this plurality of perspectives. And so, yeah, how do we ensure that we understand each other maximally? How do we make sure that our arguments and that our conceptions, that our perspectives are sort of mutually intelligible, maximally so, just as one seeks to understand another natural language for mutual intelligibility, so it is with the conceptual vocabulary of philosophy bridging a tradition like Vajrayana, which has its own rich philosophical and empirical basis, derived from the direct personal experience of thousands of practitioners over, well over a millennium now, alongside the tradition of science with its underlying philosophical epistemology of naturalism or positivism, if you will. We'll get into the specifics of those in a minute. And its corpus of observations of data. So it's in seeking that mutual translation layer that I bring up the topics of this presentation. And so other purposes that can help here are just to better facilitate how we apply or implement the findings of the research, so as not to overstate their relevance nor to overlook or diminish them. Just, again, greater precision, greater clarity. Connecting the findings in terms of their methods, in terms of the evidence collected, in terms of the success of experimental design, and in terms of the significance of the interpretations, how to connect those to other fields of study and learn from those to enrich further efforts. Also to streamline how it's taught, right? I mean, the accumulation of knowledge is all well and good, but if it can't be adequately transmitted in direct proportion to its accumulation, well, it means that we're leaving out an important couple of steps. And also to expand the discourse, to wider audience outside of the specialists that can then apply them. And so, otherwise, what are some other answers to the question of why? What's the purpose of deepening the discourse in this way by focusing on, the layer of epistemology? Well, just to help us refine and make sense of the layer of theory that we use to guide, organize, and connect the empirical findings that are so abundant now, to clarify their implications, and to avoid any unnecessary contestation and controversy. Now, the pursuit of scientific inquiry necessarily entails, contested interpretation, argument, controversy. And insofar as we're doing that anyway, well, we should avoid any unnecessary aspects of it. And so, without epistemically informed higher order theory, we run the difficulty of the accumulating evidence from the various neuroimaging studies, other directions in psychology and cognitive science that don't necessarily rely on neuroimaging but have relevance for it. We run the risk of these different varieties of studies becoming sort of islands of findings that they admit to some higher level integration, but that can only take place at the level of sort of an overarching unified theory. Now that involves conceptualization, of course, and this is the area in which the existing vocabulary of epistemic debate from Vajrayana's tradition and from the so-called Western, now just sort of internationalized philosophical tradition share common ground. They're really not so different, right? Rather than keep relying on the term Western as it's often still referred to in the literature, in order to avoid a controversial term, one useful strategy is to make up a neologism with some Latin in it. So instead of saying Western, I turn to a term Occidentic, right? Refers to Western, but not to overemphasize it or reify it. It just means has vague connections to the history of the development of those ideas in what we once called the West. So this tradition with Vajrayana's own epistemology, rooted back through the two truths that many in this room are already deeply familiar with, starting from the Indian tradition, Dignaga, Dharmakirti, Chandrakirti, through the debates between the Prasangikas, the Madhyamikas. It turns out there is a surprising degree of overlap, but still enough important differences to keep it interesting. Enough to shake up our own approaches to it, to shake up our own interpretive frames that we might learn something new. So, assuming that everyone will be more familiar with the underlying interpretations of what counts as valid knowledge from a Vajrayana perspective, I'll give a quick primer of some of the main concepts of philosophy of science. Again, I'm not trying to persuade anyone of a particular argument. I'm just trying to lay out a couple of general concepts around which we can continue to think together about this material, and hopefully that can frame some of our understandings of the remaining topics, remaining content brought up in other subsequent speakers' presentations throughout the conference. So basically, philosophy of science is dealing with the relationships between our explanatory theories of why phenomena take place and have the dynamics and the relationships that they do. What constitutes the evidence on which we justify saying those theories are valid or useful? And then by what mechanisms of experimentation or collecting data and subjecting them to conceptual testing we can use to say that the evidence is good or not. Simple enough, right? There's no need to go through all of these. I list just a couple of columns of ancillary considerations that fill the literature of debate and argument in philosophy of science. We'll notice that with a few exceptions, these are all contents that can be found in treatises on Buddhist epistemology, going back the better part of 2,000 years. The notion of validity, what counts as valid inference, what counts as a valid relationship between an observation or perception and a concept, the notion of measurement, how do we identify, quantify different observations and fit those into explanations. And then what are the criteria for saying that an explanation is accurate or not? How do we falsify it, in other words? And whether we do that or not, well then how do we generalize the resulting claims to knowledge into other fields, into other tests, into other bodies of evidence? Thank you. So the main perspectives here, I'll just sort of gloss over these since time is growing short. Usually, learning philosophy of science, we discuss the insights from the philosophers Karl Popper, who emphasized falsification of weak theories to drive the improvement of stronger ones. The more socially and historically minded philosopher Thomas Kuhn, who emphasized that there are irrational factors shaping our understanding of scientific progress. And the most recent, Imre Lakatos, who helped us learn how to distinguish between research programs, combinations of theory and evidence that are making progress versus those that are sort of stagnating or degenerating. And so the central debates basically hinge on how to justify claims to knowledge. Again, if you want to dig into this, find me after the talk or read the resulting paper. But with the time running out, there's not a lot of ground to cover on these details. Suffice it to say that these distinctions are also reflected in the history of Buddhist epistemology. In particular, it's worth noting that the Pramanavan view, for example, was an example of what in the West we would call foundationalism. Madhyamaka reflects a perspective in Western philosophy we would call coherentism. Just to make the point that there's a lot more overlap between the two systems than is often supposed. This is not to say that we can take the equivalence as unproblematic, just that there's enough ground to persist. So, to close, having argued that there's enough common ground in the philosophical underpinning of how each tradition justifies the accumulation and claims of knowledge and how findings relate to each other and enhance our understanding, and how we can go about arguing about such notions profitably instead of unproductively, then what are some examples of untapped potential, of directions that the relationship can proceed? So the evolution of the field of systems theory and scientific endeavor has been extraordinarily profitable for multiple fields spanning molecular biology through applied health medicine. Nearly any field of scientific endeavor has benefited from methods derived under the label of general systems theory. This has been progressed to a more intricate version known as complex adaptive systems theory that has itself already become extremely well integrated into the cognitive science and even many methodological approaches of neuroscience. What's fascinating here is that the influence of Vajrayana is already in these theoretic constructs through the thinkers Evan Thompson, Francisco Varela, Eleanor Roche, and many other authors of foundational works who had been studying Vajrayana before outlining their contributions to these theories. And indeed, thank you, sir. And so the notion of dependent origination, right? It is deeply infused in the notion of systems theory as it was devised by these Western philosophers who had significant Vajrayana practice and training under experienced masters. However, we have yet to elaborate and specify in great detail the concepts from the theory of dependent origination in Buddhist epistemology into Western conceptions of systems theory. There's ample ground and for progress in that domain. I list it just as an example. And there were a few others that I was hoping to conclude with, just further directions that we can take. But all I will say is that the main participants from both communities in this dialogue, I believe that if there's anything that they share in common, it's that they recognize that there still remains far too much suffering, too much insufficiency of our solutions to suffering in the world, and that as one of its primary causes, ignorance, pervades all aspects of life in the world to a greater degree than any of us can be satisfied with tolerating. Let us approach resolutions to ignorance through any means necessary, through Vajrayana practice, through the conduct of scientific inquiry, and through the philosophical connecting layer of theory and argumentation that can help us understand both even better. So, thank you.